Robert Mengaliso Sobukwe became one of apartheid South Africa's most consequential political leaders without holding public office or leading a legal movement for long. Born in Graaff-Reinet on December 5, 1924, he rose from the world of mission schooling, teaching, and student politics to become the first president of the Pan Africanist Congress. Yet after he helped launch a nationwide campaign against the PAC laws in 1960, the state removed him from public life. When his 3-year prison sentence ended, the government changed the law to keep him confined. That contradiction defines the biography of Robert Sobukwe. His years of direct political leadership were limited, but the apartheid government considered his influence serious enough to isolate him on Robben Island and then restrict almost every part of his later life. His name became attached to a legal provision designed around his case, the Sobukwe Clause. Sobukwe was born into a South Africa already organized by racial exclusion. Black South Africans faced restrictions on land, education, work, movement, and political participation long before the National Party formally introduced apartheid after its 1948 election victory. For an educated African family, schooling could offer an important route into teaching, church work, or the small professional class. It did not offer equal citizenship. He attended Helltown, a well-known Methodist institution in the Eastern Cape that educated many future African leaders. The school's academic discipline and Christian environment formed part of his early education, but the political reality outside its grounds remained unavoidable. Black South Africans could gain qualifications while still being denied the rights that white citizens exercised as a matter of law. Sobukwe continued his education at the University College of Fort Hare. Fort Hare was one of the few institutions providing higher education to black South Africans, and it became a meeting point for students who would later shape liberation politics across Southern Africa. Its graduates included leaders from several political traditions, but the institution itself operated under the wider limits of segregation. At Fort Hare, Sobukwe became involved in student politics and the African National Congress Youth League. The Youth League had emerged in the 1940s with a sharper demand for African political initiative. Its members criticized older forms of petitioning and constitutional appeal, arguing that mass organization and African leadership were necessary against white minority rule. Sobukwe completed a Bachelor of Arts degree at Fort Hare in 1947. He was academically able, but his later public role was not built on academic distinction alone. It came from the combination of education, public speaking, organizational work, and a developing belief that Africans should lead their own liberation struggle. After university, he worked as a teacher. Teaching mattered politically in apartheid South Africa because classrooms were among the few places where educated black South Africans could exercise authority and influence younger generations. But the profession was also increasingly constrained by the state's racial education system. Sobukwe taught at Standerton and later at Orlando High School in Soweto. Orlando High School stood in a rapidly expanding African township near Johannesburg, where residents lived under the pressures of migrant labor, overcrowding, municipal control, and PAC regulations. His move to Johannesburg placed him closer to the country's main center of black political organizing. He also became associated with the African National Congress and its Youth League during a period when the ANC was moving toward mass campaigns. The Defiance Campaign of 1952 had brought thousands of volunteers into deliberate acts of civil disobedience against segregation laws. It demonstrated the potential of nonviolent mass action, but it also brought arrest, banning orders, and heavier state surveillance. Sobukwe's political ideas developed within these arguments, not outside them. He supported resistance to white rule, but he increasingly differed from ANC leaders over alliances, political language, and the place of Africans within the liberation movement. His position was rooted in African nationalism, the belief that the African majority, dispossessed in its own country, had to exercise primary political leadership. In 1954, Sobukwe joined the University of the Witwatersrand as a lecturer in African Studies. Wits was a predominantly white university, and his appointment made him one of the relatively few black lecturers at the institution. The position gave him a platform among students and academics, while also exposing him to debates about race, colonialism, and political power. In 1959, he delivered a graduation address at Wits that later became one of his best-known public statements. He spoke directly about the contradiction of addressing students in a society built on racial hierarchy. The speech established a pattern visible throughout his political career. He did not avoid the language of power or soften the reality of African dispossession for a comfortable audience. By the late 1950s, disagreement inside the ANC had become an organizational crisis. A major point of tension was the Freedom Charter, adopted by the Congress of the People in 1955. The charter called for a non-racial South Africa and was associated with the Congress Alliance, which included the ANC, the South African Indian Congress, the Coloured People's Congress, the Congress of Democrats, and the South African Congress of Trade Unions. Sobukwe and other Africanists believed this approach diluted African leadership. They did not simply object to cooperation with other oppressed groups. The central argument was that Africans, as the largest group subjected to political exclusion and land dispossession, should not be treated as one partner among several in determining the country's future. The split became formal in 1959. On April 6, the Pan Africanist Congress was launched in Orlando, and Robert Sobukwe was elected its first president. The PAC presented itself as an African nationalist organization committed to ending white domination and establishing political power for the African majority. This was the decisive institutional turning point in a Robert Sobukwe biography. He was no longer only a teacher, lecturer, or participant in internal political debate. He now led a new national organization that had to prove it could mobilize people beyond speeches and conference resolutions. The PAC's message centered on African self-determination and rejected the Congress Alliance's multiracial political framework. Its leaders argued that apartheid had divided people by race in order to preserve white minority control, and that liberation required Africans to act as the principal force against that system. The PAC's outlook attracted activists who felt the older movement was moving too slowly or compromising too much. The party faced an immediate practical problem. The ANC had deeper organizational structures, a longer history, and more international recognition. The PAC needed an action that could make its program visible across the country and demonstrate that it could organize disciplined resistance. It chose the pass laws. Pass laws controlled the movement of black South Africans through documents commonly known as passes or reference books. These documents recorded personal and employment details, and police could demand to see them. Failure to produce a pass, or being found in an area without authorization, could lead to arrest, fines, or removal. For African workers and families, the pass system was not an abstract symbol. It regulated where people could live, where they could seek work, and whether they could remain in urban areas. The system supported the economy of racial segregation by controlling black labor while denying black citizens equal rights in the cities they helped build. The PAC announced an anti-pass campaign for March 21, 1960. Its plan was deliberately simple: volunteers would leave their passes at home, go to police stations, and ask to be arrested. The action aimed to overwhelm the machinery of pass law enforcement through nonviolent, open defiance. Sobukwe wrote to the Commissioner of Police before the campaign, stating that the PAC intended the demonstrations to be peaceful. That letter was politically significant. It recorded that the organization was not calling for armed attacks or secret action. Its strategy was public confrontation with an unjust law. On the morning of March 21, Sobukwe went to the Orlando police station in Soweto without his pass and presented himself for arrest. He was taken into custody. The PAC president had placed himself under the same law that the campaign challenged, making his arrest part of the action rather than an event separate from it. Demonstrations also took place in other locations, including Sharperville, near Vereeniging. At Sharperville, police opened fire on a crowd of protesters. 69 people were killed, and many others were wounded. The dead included people shot while fleeing, a fact that became central to the event's historical meaning. Sobukwe was not at Sharperville when the shootings occurred, and he did not order the police violence. But the massacre took place during the PAC's anti-pass campaign, which connected his organization permanently to one of the defining crises of apartheid South Africa. The state's response to peaceful protests revealed how far it was prepared to go to maintain racial control. The Sharperville massacre triggered outrage inside South Africa and abroad. It also intensified government repression. A state of emergency was declared, thousands of people were detained, and the state moved against political organizations that had challenged apartheid through mass mobilization. The ANC and the PAC were banned in 1960 under the Unlawful Organizations Act. The ban did not end opposition to apartheid, but it destroyed the possibility of open legal organizing for both movements. For the PAC, still a young organization, the timing was especially damaging. Its first major national campaign had brought enormous attention, but its leadership and membership now faced arrest, detention, exile, and underground work. Sobukwe was prosecuted for incitement arising from the anti-pass campaign. He was convicted and sentenced to 3 years in prison. The conviction reflected the apartheid state's determination to criminalize political mobilization, even when the action had been framed as non-violent civil disobedience. His sentence did not make him politically irrelevant. It did the opposite. The government had removed the PAC's most recognizable leader at the moment the organization became nationally known. Yet his imprisonment made him a symbol of the anti-apartheid struggle and of the wider repression that followed Sharpeville. For much of his imprisonment, Sobukwe was held on Robben Island. The island prison, off the coast of Cape Town, later became internationally known for holding political prisoners, including Nelson Mandela and other opponents of apartheid. Sobukwe's imprisonment there had a distinctive feature: he was kept apart from other political prisoners. The isolation was not merely a prison routine. It prevented him from discussing politics, building relationships, or participating in the informal education and debate that developed among many political prisoners. The state was not simply restricting his physical movement. It was trying to limit his ability to influence and organize political community. His 3-year sentence was due to end in 1963. Under ordinary legal expectations, completing a sentence should have meant release. The apartheid government instead introduced a new measure through the General Law Amendment Act of 1963. The provision became widely known as the Sobukwe Clause because it was associated so directly with his case. It gave the Minister of Justice the power to order the continued detention of a prisoner after the completion of a sentence. Though framed as legislation of general application, it was used against Sobukwe alone. That decision answered a question the state had created for itself. It had already banned the PAC and imprisoned its president. But officials still feared the political consequences of allowing him to return freely to the public. The Sobukwe Clause supplied a legal mechanism for continued confinement without giving him a new ordinary criminal sentence. Sobukwe remained on Robben Island after his sentence expired. His detention was renewed year after year. He was held in conditions of separation from the other political prisoners, making his imprisonment unusually personal and unusually visible in the history of apartheid law. The clause exposed a contradiction in the government's approach. Authorities sought to portray political opponents as criminals or marginal agitators, yet they created exceptional powers to prevent one imprisoned man from resuming public activity. The law attached to Sobukwe's name became evidence of the influence the state believed he could still exercise. His confinement also affected the development of the PAC. The organization continued under severe pressure, with leaders arrested, forced underground, or driven into exile. Without Sobukwe's direct public leadership, internal divisions and strategic disputes became harder to manage. The state's isolation of one person therefore had consequences for an entire political movement. Sobukwe was eventually removed from Robben Island in 1969, but this was not a return to normal civilian life. He was taken to Kimberley and placed under severe restrictions. He could not freely rebuild the national political role that had been interrupted in 1960. The restrictions limited his movement, his associations, and his public political activity. He lived under surveillance and banning orders, tools regularly used by the apartheid state to separate activists from organizations, workplaces, meetings, and the press. A banned person could be physically outside prison while still being prevented from functioning as a public citizen. Kimberley was not chosen as a political center where he could reconnect easily with PAC structures. It was a controlled setting, far from the national networks he had helped build in Johannesburg. The authorities had shifted from island detention to administrative restriction, but the objective remained similar: prevent Robert Sobukwe from becoming an active national leader again. The personal life of Robert Sobukwe cannot be separated from these state restrictions. He was married to Veronica Sobukwe, and imprisonment, detention, and banning orders placed their family under pressures created by government policy rather than private choice. Years of separation limited ordinary family contact and made stable domestic life difficult. Veronica Sobukwe had to manage the realities of a household affected by state surveillance and the prolonged absence of her husband. The family did not experience repression only when he was arrested or taken to prison. Restrictions continued after his release from Robben Island, shaping where he could live, whom he could meet, and what work he could do. The apartheid state often treated families of political opponents as extensions of the political problem. A banning order against one person could isolate relatives socially and economically because visitors feared scrutiny and employers understood the risks attached to a politically targeted household. For the Sobukwe family, the end of formal imprisonment did not end the effects of detention. Despite those limits, Sobukwe pursued legal studies by correspondence. This was a practical decision as well as an intellectual one. The law had been used to imprison him and prolong his detention, but legal training offered a way to work within a profession even when overt political organizing remained restricted. He qualified as an attorney in the 1970s and practiced law in Kimberley. His ability to enter the legal profession did not mean the government had withdrawn its control. His political restrictions remained a continuing obstacle, and he was still prevented from returning openly to the role he had held as PAC president. His legal work showed that the later years of his life were not empty years after prison. He continued to build a professional life under conditions designed to minimize his political reach. The contrast was sharp. A man considered dangerous enough for exceptional detention was then expected to live within boundaries imposed by the same state. By the mid-1970s, South Africa was entering another period of confrontation. The 1976 Soweto uprising began after student protests against the compulsory use of Afrikaans as a medium of instruction, then spread into a broader revolt against apartheid. The uprising brought a new generation into open resistance and renewed international attention on the regime. Sobukwe did not lead the 1976 uprising. His long isolation and restrictions had limited his direct role in later mass politics. But younger activists encountered a political landscape shaped in part by the earlier anti-apartheid struggles, the banning of the PAC and ANC, and the state's repeated use of detention to suppress African political leadership. His health declined during the final years of his life. He was diagnosed with lung cancer, and the disease became increasingly serious. The government permitted him to travel abroad for treatment only after long restrictions had already narrowed his public and private life. Robert Sobukwe died in Kimberley on February 27, 1978, at the age of 53. His death came 14 years after his original prison sentence had ended and 9 years after he had been removed from Robben Island. In practical terms, the apartheid state had prevented him from returning to sustain national political leadership for most of that time. His funeral drew significant attention despite the political constraints that had surrounded his later years. For supporters, his death represented the loss of a leader whose public career had been deliberately cut short. For the government, the restrictions had succeeded in limiting his ability to organize openly, but they had not removed his name from the political memory of the country. The life of Robert Sobukwe is often told through the Sobukwe clause because the law was so exceptional. But the clause makes sense only when placed beside the rest of his record: his education at Helltown and Fort Hare, his teaching in African schools, his work at the University of the Witwatersrand, his role in the Africanist split, and his presidency of the PAC. His political position also deserves precision. Sobukwe was a leading figure in African nationalism, and he believed African leadership had to be central to the liberation of South Africa. That placed him in conflict with the ANC's Congress alliance strategy. The disagreement was serious, but it did not make the struggle against apartheid a story of only one organization or one ideology. The PAC's anti-apartheid campaign of March 1960 was a major intervention in South African history. It challenged the past laws directly, brought mass arrests into the center of the strategy, and formed the immediate national context in which the Sharpeville massacre occurred. The police shootings, rather than the peaceful act of presenting oneself for arrest, exposed the lethal force behind apartheid's system of control. A full biography of Robert Sobukwe must also recognize the cost of the state's response. His 3-year sentence became prolonged detention. His release from Robben Island became restriction in Kimberley. His marriage and family life unfolded under surveillance, separation, and political limits imposed from outside the home. Apartheid authorities succeeded in restricting Sobukwe's movements and reducing his ability to lead publicly after 1960. They did not erase the questions his politics raised: who should lead a liberation movement, how should a dispossessed majority organize, and what does a state reveal when it changes its laws to keep one political opponent confined? Robert Sobukwe remains significant as the first president of the Pan Africanist Congress, a leader of the anti-apartheid campaign, a former prisoner of Robben Island, and the man whose continued detention gave the Sobukwe clause its name. His influence should not be exaggerated into sole responsibility for South Africa's liberation. But the government's own actions showed that it regarded his return to public political life as a serious threat. That is the central fact of Robert Sobukwe's life story. A teacher and political thinker helped found a national movement, led a campaign against the past laws, and then spent much of his remaining life under imprisonment or restriction. The apartheid state controlled his body, his location, and much of his public activity. It could not make his ideas, his record, or the meaning of the law created to contain him disappear.